right. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Laura Lee, and I manage the public programs here at the museum. It's wonderful to see you all here this evening. Just a quick question. How many of you have actually been to the museum before? Just curious. Excellent. Welcome back. Quite a few first-timers, so welcome for those of you who haven't been before. Here at the Tenement Museum, we tell the stories of the immigrants, migrants, and refugees who made a home for themselves on Orchard Street. And in those stories are a lot of experiences, but it doesn't capture all of the experiences of the immigrant, migrant, and refugee lived experience. And so these opportunities, these Tenement Talks, allow us a chance to expand the conversation and talk about topics that may not come up on our tour. So we'll really value this space and this opportunity. Tonight, we are going to have the pleasure of partnering with the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit journalism organization that focuses on criminal justice. And we're going to talk about immigrant detention through the lens of their immersive documentary, Detained. And so we're really excited to think about the evolution of the immigrant detention systems and policy in this country and the impact on the families and the communities who are trying to make a home for themselves here. So I'm glad you all are here to participate in this conversation. We have a wonderful panel to engage in this topic, and we are going to save time for you all to ask questions as well. So we want you to be a part of the discussion. And I think it will be interesting. You know, I think about journalism as like the first draft of history, and 70 years from now, what will people be saying about this particular moment of our system and how we're treating newcomers to this country? So perhaps it's something that we'll explore. So I'm going to pass it off to our panel. They'll introduce themselves and get the conversation going. But I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our sponsors, Con Ed and the Department of Cultural Affairs. And I also want to thank the Immigrant Justice Corps, who were generous to help us with this evening as well. So.
Hello, my name is Nancy Heemstra, and I am a political geographer and associate professor at Stony Brook University. I am here today because my research is on detention and deportation, with looking at consequences of detention and deportation outside of U.S. borders, and also looking at immigrant detention centers in the greater New York City area.
My name is Amelia Merritt. I am an immigration attorney. I was in the, I believe, third class of Immigrant Justice Corps Fellows in New York City, and have worked since then at Brooklyn Defender Services, where I represent detained immigrants in deportation proceedings through a first-of-its-kind universal representation project called the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project.
I'm Julia Preston. I have the good fortune to be a contributing writer at the Marshall Project. I write about immigration at the Marshall Project. I was the national immigration correspondent for the New York Times for 10 years before I came to the Marshall Project, and I have the even more good fortune of being named as the executive producer on this video, which was really the easiest job that I just about ever had in journalism, because Emily did all the work and I just get a little bit of the credit. So over to you.
Hello, thank you so much to the Tenement Museum for having us this evening. My name's Cassie, and I am a journalist and a filmmaker. I direct visual journalism at the Marshall Project, and I directed and reported and created Detained, which we'll be speaking about this evening. I wanted to start off by saying that this is a very special place to be talking about immigrants. It was actually the place where my great-grandmother came through Ellis Island and lived as a Jewish woman from Austria in the tenements on the Lower East Side. And this is actually my first time here. And my parents are here tonight, and my great-grandmother raised my mother. So this is a very special opportunity for us to talk about immigrants and the American dream here at the Tenement Museum. So thank you very much for that. I was reporting on immigrant detention and sexual abuse by guards in immigrant detention centers throughout the country. At the time, I was working for the New York Times. And what I was so amazed by as I traveled across the country, I was in Georgia, I was in California, I was in Texas, I was in Philadelphia, was just how many of these detention centers there were and how many immigrants were being held inside them. And they were being civilly incarcerated, which meant that they weren't being held for a crime. They were simply waiting for their immigration hearing. And this was amazing to me. And so I started doing a lot of reading and realized that this is a phenomenon that only happened in the last 40 years. In 1978, this country was detaining less than 2,000 immigrants. And before that, only a handful. And today, that number is 52,000 immigrants held per day under Trump. So my question, which was a big one, was how the hell did we get here? And that's the premise for Detained. So tonight we're going to take you through some of these clips. I'm briefly just going to show you there was a kind of immersive build and videos that we decided to create this narrative with so that people could really engage with the system. But we also did the kind of largest deep dive and archival research on how the numbers grew over time. And so I encourage you to look at this afterwards, but this should just give you a sense of how we got here, ending with these rather large numbers up to today. Great. So I'm going to pull this up now. All right. And this is how it all started.
Throughout its history, America has detained migrants. However, in the 1950s, the government deemed detention unnecessary and inhumane, and so released immigrants to wait inside the country while their cases were processed. But over the last 40 years, detention has become a politically easy solution to America's burgeoning immigration problems. Growing largely in the shadows, the U.S. detention apparatus is now the largest in the world.
The president is looking to increase spending on larger detention facilities without congressional approval.
So, how did we get here? It all started with hundreds of boats sailing toward Florida.
Opa-locka Airport, Miami, Florida. Here begins the final processing in the United States for thousands of newly arrived Cubans. It seems as though a whole country wants to flee.
The story of America's modern detention system began with President Jimmy Carter.
All over the world, there are refugees searching for freedom.
Carter had been trying to manage flows of fleeing Haitian refugees arriving in the U.S. The situation was exacerbated when Fidel Castro allowed 150,000 Cubans to set sail to America in what's called the Mariel boat lift.
The refugees that have come here from Cuba and Haiti this year, sometimes a few days in an uncontrollable stream. We didn't anticipate it. Our laws were not designed to accommodate.
The Carter administration was trying to figure out how to respond to the political pressure that they were receiving, also this humanitarian matter that was developing very quickly.
Detention was much more a kind of a holding function. It existed for the purposes of processing people, usually overnight, maybe 2 days.
Carter's makeshift camps for fleeing Cubans and Haitians soon evolved into a formalized detention complex after the election of Ronald Reagan.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Under Reagan, even though Haitians and Cubans were both escaping repressive governments and political instability, The US feared the spread of communism and gave refuge only to those fleeing leftist regimes. And so while most Cubans were released, Haitians were detained and deported.
We see his administration take an extremely sweeping approach to detaining primarily Haitian migrants.
They weren't put in detention centers to release them. They were put in detention centers and kept there.
This pattern would continue when Reagan's attention shifted to the southern border.
Many had crossed the less than grandiose Rio Grande, trying to escape north from Central America. Anyone helping to break the law risks arrest, but matters are much more critical for some refugees.
Haitian and Cuban migration gets substituted by consistent flow of people from Central America who are fleeing the violence there. The Reagan administration's approach to Central American migrants was intimately tied to Cold War fears that socialist-inspired political movements in Central America were acting as the tip of the Soviet spear.
A new kind of colonialism stalks the world today and threatens our independence. It is brutal and totalitarian. It is not of our hemisphere, but it threatens our hemisphere.
Both El Salvador and Guatemala were ravaged by civil war, but the US backed their existing regimes and so offered no asylum to fleeing migrants. But as for Nicaragua, the US was supporting the right-wing rebels who were trying to overthrow the leftist government.
Liberty's torch doesn't shine on all those in need of a promised land. For certain pilgrims, there's no asylum.
So Nicaragua had a high rate of granting asylum, whereas Salvador and Guatemala, they were just being denied.
If immigration were to catch us and send us back to El Salvador, for sure there would be no doubt it would be sure death for all of us.
So a shift began. Detention was no longer a temporary solution, but part of the greater immigration strategy. And while immigrants were being detained at ports and borders, the Reagan administration turned its attention to combating a growing fear of crime and drugs.
Final commitment not to tolerate drugs by anyone, anytime, any place. So won't you join us in this great new national crusade?
Drug trafficking and violent crime had been on the rise, prompting harsher crime laws, and there were immigrants involved in the trafficking of illicit substances.
You had immigrants who were caught up in the war on drugs, and you had this toxic combination of people who were both criminals and people who were non-citizens, or also known as aliens. And that's where you started to see the word criminal aliens.
President Reagan says the war is on.
Reagan's drug war would lead to another expansion in immigration enforcement policy, one that dramatically expanded the power of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and local police to arrest and detain more immigrants.
Today, it gives me great pleasure to sign legislation that reflects the total commitment of the American people and their government to fight the evil of drugs.
The Anti-Drug Abuse Act targets illicit drug activity, and they certainly did that. But it also brought immigration law enforcement directly into policing of drug activity.
The act allowed local police to notify INS anytime they arrested someone they thought might be deportable. In 1998, the law was expanded.
The Anti-Drug Abuse Act adds two words that have a radical effect on the use of immigration detention. Those two words are aggravated felon. Anyone who is convicted of an aggravated felony, Congress says, must be detained. At the time, aggravated felony is defined as including only 3 crimes: murder, trafficking in firearms, and drug trafficking.
Suddenly, it wasn't just undocumented immigrants who had to worry. The aggravated felony rule applied to legal migrants. So people with green cards who had been here for decades, if convicted of one of these offenses, could be deported. No one argued with deporting murderers and traffickers. But later, under Bill Clinton, aggravated felonies expanded to include minor crimes like shoplifting and low-level drug charges. So the detention population was growing, and private companies spotted an opportunity.
The federal government at that time did not have sufficient detention capacity to deal with the rising enforcement system. So private prisons began to fill a role, as did state and local facilities. Private actors also began to see there's money in immigration detention. a number of corporations start to take advantage of this. They start to lobby the Congress, they start to get large contracts to run some of these facilities.
It has been our experience at Breakfast Corporation that the private sector can provide a timely, effective, and efficient design.
So while more facilities were built and the detention population grew, the Reagan administration was also under pressure to deal with a stream of migrants who were entering the country illegally to work.
The government estimates that 1 to 2 million people sneak into the United States every year. Half of them scramble across our unfortified desert border with Mexico as an undermanned border patrol makes a futile attempt to halt the illegal entries.
Though millions of Mexicans have been allowed to work in the U.S., in the 1960s, the government placed restrictions on immigrants from the Western Hemisphere. But U.S. employers had grown dependent on low-wage labor and so kept hiring workers regardless of their legal status, contributing to a growing undocumented population.
All of the arguments we're hearing today, we heard them in the 1980s, that the system was broken, that there were too many undocumented aliens coming in, that the borders were not secure.
So Reagan proposed comprehensive immigration reform, a combination of stricter enforcement including more border patrol agents and sanctions on employers found hiring illegal immigrants. It also introduced a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented.
Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that I will sign in a few minutes is the most comprehensive reform of our immigration laws since 1952.
The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 actually had two components to it. One was amnesty for millions of individuals, and the other was the promise of enforcement.
So the idea was that that would create a reset.
Our view is that one needs strong border enforcement and one needs strong interior enforcement.
From there on, the country would be able to manage its immigration issues. Well, what happened, of course, is that that did not happen.
We got the amnesty, but we never got the enforcement.
Holding employers accountable was very difficult to enforce. It led to people being able to get work with false documents.
Employer enforcement failed, and the amnesty didn't reach everyone. Though more than 2.5 million immigrants received green cards, another estimated 2 million undocumented people did not qualify or didn't hear about the new policy, and no substantial new channels for legal immigration were opened. So the system remained overwhelmed, and the number of unauthorized immigrants living in the country continued to soar. By the end of Reagan's presidency, America was detaining more than 6,000 immigrants daily.
So presidents of the United States suddenly faced this situation where people were continuing to complain about those who were entering the country. And the only thing that presidents and administrations could do is develop detainment.
You know, Sailor will tell you that you plug the leak in the boat before you start to bail the boat.
Well, would you like to address some of the legacies of these? Oh, sorry. Would you like to address some of the legacies of the 1986 laws and the changes that started to happen after that immigration reform?
So there are a couple of notable things about this. First of all, we are reminded that the last comprehensive immigration reform that passed in the United States was signed into law by Ronald Reagan. It's a good thing to remember. And that set up this kind of equation. You have border enforcement and you have a path to citizenship or some form of liberalization or legal status for undocumented people. And that was the last time when this equation actually, was both sides of the equation were included in the in legislation. And what happened is from the Republican side of things is that this political balance has never been achieved again. And the Republicans have argued the position that Judge Arthur argues there, which is that we got the amnesty, but we never got the enforcement. Now, there are lots of reasons why that happened, and a lot of it has to do with the demand for labor in the United States and the failure, for example, of the 1986 law to open up any new avenues to legal immigration. So there was an amnesty that was backward-looking, but there was no forward-looking path to legal status for the many, many millions of workers who were coming into the United States at that time. So in effect, we created an extra legal labor system, but the 1986 law also created this kind of political deadlock that has continued to weigh down the whole immigration discussion, and to this day has essentially made it impossible for Congress to advance forward on immigration reform.
This is also the moment where the private prison industry comes into play. So private prisons, many people don't know, the first ever private prison was an immigrant detention center in 1984. And it was in Houston. And these companies that we now know as Geo Group and CoreCivic, which were then Wackenhut and CCA, started growing. And at first, they constituted about 15% of immigrants in the detention system. Today, that number is over 70%. Private companies run and hold 70% of immigrants in detention. So this became an industry. And as private prisons move away from and there are more kind of progressive policies on moving away from private prisons in our actual prison system, they see this opportunity where they're getting at least a third of their profits and growing from immigrant detention.
Well, should we talk now about what happens once Clinton takes office and how he carries on these patterns?
Sure. So I can start in that there's a shift that happens when Clinton comes into office, and a kind of shift in the temperature of the country and fear towards immigrants. You have two events that happened, the Oklahoma City bombing and the World Trade Center bombing. And though in the Oklahoma City bombing, this was actually white Americans who had committed this, there began to be this fear of the other, that other people could come in and do the same thing with the World Trade Center bombing. And then you have the 1994 elections where the Republicans take hold of Congress. And again, what Julia pointed to, this kind of struggle between Republicans and Democrats leads to immigrant detention becoming a trading tool.
And the other thing you see with Clinton is this, what you might call the sort of the Democrats' immigration paradox, which is the Democrats seem to feel a burden, which you see with Clinton, and then we'll see it again when President Obama takes office. They feel a burden to prove that they're tough on immigration enforcement. And the narrative is, well, we're going to prove that we have good cred on immigration enforcement, and that will give us the political space to pass some kind of immigration reform with a path to citizenship for undocumented people. In the case of Bill Clinton, the way this worked was in 1996, Clinton signed into law a series of laws and statutes that to this day are plaguing the immigration system. And mainly what happened there was that these aggravated felonies were redefined down to a much lower level of offense. And so, and reminding you that this applies not only to undocumented people, but also to people that have had status, green card holders. Suddenly, if you have a low-level drug possession or of a gambling or shoplifting, suddenly you are eligible and exposed and vulnerable to the penalty in the immigration system. And one of the things that's important to remember about the immigration system is you can't sort of bargain down your sentence in the immigration system. In the immigration system, you're either in or you're out. So it's like, it's, the most severe sentence is pretty much all that's available if you do not win your legal case.
Yeah, and I can sort of give an example about what this looks like today. So it was the redefinition of aggravated felony, but also all kinds of other definitions, like any kind of controlled substance offense, which is anything, crimes involving moral turpitude. Good luck defining that, but the government often argues it includes things like turnstile jumping. And a host of other categories of offenses that either make you ineligible for many forms of relief, for defenses to your deportation, or put you in a mandatory detention category. So not only do these laws create the expanded ability to detain people, but detain people without the opportunity to ask for bond. And so an example of a case I currently have, I have a client right now who has been a green card holder since the early 90s. He has been detained since August, I believe, early August. He is under mandatory detention, meaning we have no right to even request a bond hearing. Because of misdemeanor marijuana convictions, two of them from the 90s. That makes him completely both ineligible to even request a bond hearing. They also make him ineligible for the best kind, the basically standard defense to deportation for a green card holder. Sadly, he has a very reasonable fear of return to his home country, so I've been able to litigate that case. But he's been detained since August. We're supposed to get a decision on the case next week. But then, not only is everything our burden, but even if we win and if the government decides to appeal, he stays detained. So it's just, sort of layer upon layer upon layer of injustice.
President Clinton, of course, was the master of triangulation and ensuring that everybody had what they needed.
In order to make sure that he had funding for education programs, funding for healthcare programs, funding for research programs, all the priorities, there were compromises made. The one area where there was some sense of being able to get some things through was the issue of detainment.
We are a nation of immigrants, and we should all be proud of it. But we are also a nation of laws. It is wrong and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit the kind of abuse of our immigration laws that we have seen in recent years. There is too much of it, and we must do much more to stop it.
When I first came into the commissioner's position, I brought a group called the Vera Institute for Justice to look at whether people could be assured of showing up for their hearings without being in detention. We demonstrated that it would be less expensive. It doesn't need to be solely detention in prison-like circumstances. But then the 1996 laws came.
Near the anniversary of the Oklahoma bombings, the first of the 1996 Act passed, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act.
The Act, along with the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, drastically changed the immigration system. The laws expanded the categories of aggravated felonies to include smaller crimes like gambling, theft, and low-level drug charges. Now, any legal migrant convicted of one of these crimes had to be detained and deported.
In the past, they would have gotten a bond hearing. The next was mandatory detention for people arriving at the border, asylum seekers.
Anyone caught crossing the border illegally would automatically be detained and deported without a hearing unless they could convince an officer they had a legitimate fear of injury, persecution, or death. It was called expedited removal.
I was responsible for the work that the INS did on the 1996 laws. Well, we were extremely concerned about the provisions. Expedited removal was a very important concern, that we would be able to simply remove people who might have asylum claims in the country.
In the past, asylum seekers would have automatically had the right to argue their cases in front of a judge, but now immigration officers have the discretion to reject their claims. Finally, the government said that people whose countries wouldn't accept them back could be detained indefinitely.
So there were thousands of people who were detained. They were known as lifers. If their country wouldn't take them back, then they could be detained for life. You had that ironic thing where it was a Democratic administration. You had Commissioner of Immigration, Doris Meissner, who was basically sympathetic towards immigrants, but it was during that administration that this machinery was put in place. And now it's just being used to the hilt.
You've worked on it, you've given your best advice, you've won a lot of battles, you've lost a lot of battles. That's the process, that's democracy. But at the end of the day, it was the president's decision. And so then the job is, we've got to figure out how to make this work.
So the next era and the next kind of critical change after these 1996 laws is 9/11. And of course, this changed the feeling in the country towards immigrants and made it exceptionally difficult to win cases in the Supreme Court and at other levels of the courts that would gain rights for immigrants in detention. So Judy Rabinovitz, who was just speaking on the screen, who's the head of the Immigrants' Right Project at the ACLU, had fought a case in 2001 and was actually able to win that case in the Supreme Court. But just a couple years later, in 2003, that was no longer the case.
What effects does the creation of the Department of Homeland Security have in the aftermath of 9/11 and the reaction, the very strong anti-immigrant reactions, and kind of this new idea of Homeland Security and national security do?
Well, this created an entirely new overlay for the entire immigration system, the way the federal government thought about the immigration system. Now you had incredibly present the notion that you would not only have undocumented workers or Cuban refugees or refugees from Haiti coming across the border in an uncontrolled fashion, but that the whole idea that an uncontrolled border exposed the United States to the arrival of terrorists, the undetected arrival of terrorists. And this had this extraordinary impact on the system that create the Department of Homeland Security, what had been one agency that was in charge of the entire immigration system. Now you create a separate agency that has a mandate just for enforcement, immigration and customs enforcement. You break out the Border Patrol into several different agencies, and in the description of the department and the oath that everyone takes, every officer takes when they get sworn in, defending the country against terrorism is the priority, is the primary purpose of the Department of Homeland Security and the immigration system. So what conceivably could have at some point been conceived as a system that was designed to bring people in, to welcome people, to fashion the arrival of people to the United States, according to interests that might have to do with the labor market or some other interest. This now becomes a essentially restrictive system that is encouraging the detention of people who are not right with the system.
And Michael Chertoff, who you'll meet in just a second, was the second head of the Department of Homeland Security. And one thing that he says in this video is that people had in their mind that they were confusing migrants with terrorists. Those were different things, but, we needed to protect the borders and make sure that people felt safe. And this also played into the ending of a policy that Chertoff and the Bush administration called catch and release. And this was the idea that immigrants would be caught and then released into the country to await their hearings and then would never show up. Now, the problem with that was that many of those immigrants never were told where their hearings were or what they were supposed to do, because the notices would go to where they had arrived and they would already be in other parts of the country. And so Chertoff and the Bush administration decided to end catch and release, and what that meant was that more people were going to be detained. They would be caught and then they would be put in detention.
And I'll ask you the question, but I mean, presumably today you're seeing the results of this. That's a period where the crackdown at the border becomes much more intense, and I presume you're seeing today people that have final orders of removal that they never even knew about from that period.
Yes, we certainly do see that, and the population of people that ends up getting detained in the New York City area, it can change a lot with enforcement priorities that are sort of invisibly happening behind the scenes. But yes, we see many people with prior, old orders of removal that they didn't know about, or that were under circumstances that are more complicated than they seem, and yes, the border. We see lots of longtime New Yorkers or New York City area people, either who have status or who don't have status but have lived in the United States for decades. But then we also get lots of people, recent arrivals from the border, and that sort of, those numbers all change.
And I would just add that I think at this time, especially in this post 9/11 period, is when you have this, with the end of catch and release and this idea of we must detain everybody, you start to see this language of detention works as deterrence. So this idea that we have to detain people not just to keep them from absconding, but also because that in itself, that message will be carried to people who are considering migration, and they will decide not to come, right? So it's also thought of as this tool to deter people. And one thing that I've found doing research in Latin America is that is very much not the case, right? Most, over 50% of people, at least in the work that I did, were deported and immediately turned around and came right back. And that message is not getting out to other people, that the reality does not happen, that detention works to deter future immigration.
So that leads us to Chertoff and Bush attempting an immigration reform. And this is kind of another moment where this idea of comprehensive immigration reform comes into the picture. Chertoff is looking to find some paths to legalization, as well as ramping up border enforcement. And of course, it doesn't satisfy the Democrats or the Republicans.
Recognize just trying to stop illegal immigration using typical enforcement tools is like trying to hold back an ocean with your bare hand. Our intent was to actually develop a legal system for people to work temporarily. But to make that effective, you have to shut off the illegal system. What you need to do is to crack down on the employers who are the ones who are essentially instigating the violation of the law.
The Bush administration proposed both a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants and more border fencing and enforcement agents. It was met with opposition on both sides. Republicans rejected the proposal, calling it another amnesty.
Republicans want to see the enforcement take place before there is any discussion of amnesty. People believe that aliens who come to the United States should do it the right way, should do it the way that their ancestors did it, should do it the way that 4 million people standing in line right now waiting for visas to come to the United States are doing it.
My children are at stake here, their future. And this is not the province of Mexico.
We are divided by a common enemy, and it is not Mexicans, it is not Latinos.
Here, work in a very honest way. We are not criminals.
Ultimately, the Senate rejected Bush's immigration bill.
When immigration reform failed, I thought it was really a missed opportunity. And I thought it was a pity we were going to continue to enforce the laws we're obliged to do, but in the most clumsy way possible. My hope was that the Obama administration would be able to get it passed.
It's much easier to create these sorts of harsh laws than it is to dismantle them.
The name of the game was he needed to show, or he felt like he needed to show that he was tough on enforcement, and so you play the game.
While deportations grew,
So that brings us to the Obama era and some of the major shifts that happen with Obama.
Should I do? Yeah, go ahead. So one of the things that happened under the Obama administration is that Obama extended across the country a system that connected every police station in the country to the immigration system by way of the fingerprints that a person would give whenever they were booked into by the police for any reason. So this could be if you had to spend the night overnight in jail because of traffic offense. Starting in 2008 and through the first term of President Obama, this system spread across the country so that for the first time, any offense, any situation that brought you into the custody of any police could suddenly expose you to being detected by the immigration system. And the result of this was, in the first term of President Obama, this huge spiral of the number of deportations. And the reason why President Obama earned what many think is the apt moniker of the deporter-in-chief. Janet Murguia, who was the head of Unidos USA, which used to be NCLR, which before that was the National Council of La Raza, gave Obama that title, and that's why.
And I would just add that I think, not that this is necessarily new in the Obama era, but under Obama and what I see now as a continued, like, sort of more accepted view of things is this, like, pitting of good, quote unquote, good immigrants versus bad immigrants. And particularly with priority memos having to do with contact with the criminal justice system, Obama talking about focusing on deporting felons and not families. The problem with that is that these are not separate people. Obama is, in particular, a person who can talk about the extreme failings and injustices embedded into our criminal justice system, and yet the second that person is a non-citizen, all of that disappears, and they're deserving of whatever comes to them. So that's something that I've seen. It's just a very salient part of our work.
So the Obama administration also attempts a reform, just like each administration before him. And it's able to pass Democratic Senate, but John Boehner refuses to bring it to the floor. And again, there's this argument from the Republicans, there's not enough security, there's not enough enforcement, and from, the liberals and the left, there's not enough pathways to citizenship. There's not, so both sides are unhappy with this. it doesn't get anywhere. And one of the things is about the idea of detention as deterrence is that regardless of how the immigration detention system grows, people continue to come. People continue to come because they're fleeing dire circumstances, they're fleeing violence, much of that violence that the U.S. has been involved with, as we saw in Central America, which Julia, who you should speak to afterwards about this, has reported on and was there reporting on these countries extensively. And so what you end up with is detention as this kind of stopgap. Let's just keep detaining people regardless of whether it's really necessary, and then you start to see these conditions getting worse. And what happens in 2014 is you have this surge of unaccompanied children from Central America arriving at the U.S. border.
So in 2014, it was unaccompanied children, but also children coming with parents. So what the border authorities referred to as a family unit, and the context for this was, again, this sort of democratic paradox where this was right in the period of time where Obama saw that there was a possibility, there might be a possibility to persuade the House to pass the bill that had, to take up and pass the bill that had passed the Senate. And then just when he was trying to sort of put that together, the families started to arrive from Central America. And I think Jay Johnson, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the President himself saw those families as a threat to the political possibilities of passing comprehensive immigration reform. So the politics of that became very difficult, and the response of the Obama administration was to create new detention centers to detain families. So there had been family detention in prior years, but by dint of very tenacious litigation, the whole idea of family detention had been substantially discredited in the courts. And then Obama took it up again and opened 2 detention centers in Texas and revived a detention center for families. That is to say, it's mostly mothers and children in Berks County, Pennsylvania. And so then that's another thing that you see is the expansion of the detention center system for families as well.
And that's where some of the images you saw circulating of children in cages that were actually from the Obama era were shown during the child separation kind of media storm around that time. Now, in 2016, right before Trump takes office, you have a population that has grown now daily to around 34,000 immigrants being held in immigrant detention per day. And I'll remind you that that number is now 52,000 just in the first administration of the Trump presidency, maybe the only, but the first at least. We have a sense of what happens with this child separation policy and the media storm that ensues, and that kind of brings us to where we are now.
All part and parcel of the same thing. It's like, we don't want you here. We don't want you here, so we're going to make it really bad. We are locking people up. We're sending them back to countries where they're in danger. This is a life and death situation for people.
In the Trump administration, people started saying, this is a deterrent policy. This is a punitive policy. We're going to use detention as a way to punish people.
Decades of detention in America have not deterred the flow of migrants. And unrest and instability in Central America has caused yet another surge of immigrants arriving at the U.S. border in 2019. At the same time, it's fueled a thriving industry run mostly by private prison companies, who now hold more than 70% of detainees.
The reality of immigration detention is that people are locked up in county jails. They're locked up in federal prisons. They're locked up in privately owned and profit-maximizing institutions that are surrounded by barbed wire.
By September of 2019, more than 52,000 people were held in detention. On average, they were held for over a month, some spending years behind bars and costing American taxpayers billions of dollars.
It is a history of failed efforts to deal with the real issues involved in immigration. And so you focus on what's easy politically. What is easy politically? Detainment, enforcement, border security, the whole idea of building walls.
It's not really just about the border, it's about the entire system. I would start by looking at what are the conditions that are driving people to leave their homes and come up to the U.S.
A civil incarceration system born 40 years ago has now become the foundation of America's approach to immigration. And it hasn't solved the issues that led to its creation in the first place: a large undocumented population and migrants at the southern border fleeing violence. And it continues to grow, becoming what is now the largest immigrant detention system in the world.
I think history is going to look back on this moment in time and paint not a very attractive picture of how America handled this moment. You're looking for somebody to blame. Fact is, we're all to blame for what happened.
So, what happens under Trump, of course, is something called zero tolerance. And zero tolerance was this idea that if you crossed the border illegally, you were going to be detained or prosecuted. And this had not been the case beforehand for most immigrants. And so what you saw during that time was when parents were taken away, you started having kids who were separated from their parents. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after. But the reason we're all here and why we're telling this story is because it has very real human consequences. These systems that are so vast and have grown so rapidly have traumatic impacts on thousands and thousands and thousands of people and will affect this kind of whole generation of children and people who have these very visceral memories of being locked up in these facilities, not for committing a crime, but merely just waiting to either seek asylum or make a home in a country that they had hoped would be this safe haven for them.
It's been called the most dangerous place on earth to be a woman. Thousands fleeing to our shores to escape a machismo culture racked by gang violence.
Mi ex marido es asesino. A veces venía untado de sangre y él me ponía a lavar la ropa. Así él me encerraba, afilaba armas y me amenazaba que me cortaría la cabeza. Me violaba. Fue que decidí agarrar a mis 2 hijos y salí. Pensé que viniéndome para Estados Unidos era el lugar más lejos donde no me podía encontrar él. Caminábamos en las yardas o montañas. Yo llegué el 3 de agosto de 2017 al Paso, Texas. Agarraron a mis hijos, me pusieron 2 esposas en las manos y en los pies. Mis hijos lloraban mucho y me decían que, mami, ¿por qué los trajo acá si usted dijo que acá íbamos a estar mejor? Y era mentira.
No sabía lo que estaba pasando. Solo pensaba yo a dónde me iban a llevar.
Como madre no se puede explicar.
Éramos 3, los metieron en un cuarto, eran como cárceles. Mi mamá lloraba. Y yo le dije, silencio.
Mi vida en la detención era un infierno. Empecé a enfermarme porque no sabía cómo cuidarlos, porque no lo sabía dónde estaban. Me sentía con ganas de morirme. La guarda de seguridad nos decían que somos unas plagas. O sea, podemos contaminarlos a ellos porque traemos enfermedades. Cuando ya tenía más de un mes, una trabajadora social me llamó. El día que me fui de la detención, un guardia me encerraron en un baño y me dijo que no tenía que contar nada de lo que había pasado ahí porque entonces sería deportada para mi país y que iba a estar vigilada toda la vida por migración. Pensé que mis hijos me iban a abrazar cuando llegara, pero mis hijos se escondieron porque ellos pensaban que yo los había regalado. Y me decían mis hijos que a dónde estaba cuando a ellos les dolía el estómago, la panza, sus muelas, que hacía un año que no los miraba. Nunca van a entenderlo, pues. Y a veces mis hijos se levantan también en la noche, me van a tocar, que pensaban que estaban encerrados en ese lugar donde estuvieron. Todavía siento que estoy viviendo ese año. Tengo pesadillas, no puedo dormir. Despierto en las noches y siento que estoy en la detención. Pero no me sentí mal haber venido a Estados Unidos. Si no me hubiera venido a huir a este país, quizás mis hijos y yo estuviéramos muertos.
Do we want to talk more about now or open it up for questions?
No.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Are you gonna have questions?
Oh, sorry. I think we'll talk a little bit about the current moment now. Amelia, maybe some of what you're seeing. Roxana is obviously one of many people who have gone through the system. Amelia works with them on a daily basis, people who are still locked up. And so I turn it over to you on what you're seeing on the front lines today, and to Julia, who's still actively reporting on so many of these people.
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, I graduated from law school in 2016, so I became an immigration lawyer in September of 2016. And we, although none of this is brand new, that is not to say that there have not been sweeping and horrific changes. So sometimes it feels like, every day you go to work and there's an email about some new policy, and the sad thing, the federal government has a lot of power in this area. The law is extremely broad, and this administration has harnessed that power to its full extent, and many would argue beyond the power of even that broad law. But, that litigation takes time. So some of the huge changes that we've seen are the Remain in Mexico policy, where people are being forced to wait to have their cases heard, being forced to wait in Mexico rather than being admitted into the United States. People who have entered or presented themselves at the border for asking for asylum after a certain date are now barred from asylum if they didn't ask a third country that they passed through along the way for asylum, despite the fact that those countries do not have robust systems set up for people asking asylum, and in many cases are very dangerous themselves. So there are other forms of defense to deportation that have to do with fear of return, but asylum is what would offer people fleeing death, really, is a path to a green card and citizenship and the ability to bring their families. All of that is completely cut off if they didn't, for instance, request asylum in Guatemala or in Mexico along the way. There's a constant barrage of, the Board of Immigration Appeals, the Attorney General himself can just issue decisions that change, some laws that have been in place for a long time. So that's been something huge. The decreased independence of judges in immigration court as they are asked to fulfill basically like quotas of how many cases they're supposed to hear. The system's not set up for that at all. What else? In 2018, the summer of 2018, from one day to the next, the detained immigration court in New York City is at Varick and Houston. So some of you probably spend a lot of time right around there. Respondents, what we call defendants in immigration court, had always been, people had always been brought in person for their hearings. From one day to the next, that was stopped, and now almost everyone appears for their hearings over video, despite the fact that they're, just about a 20-minute drive away. Obviously, you can see how that would affect outcomes of cases. And just, I would say, like a constant raising of the bar of what you need to show to have any possibility of winning. And the government appeals almost every decision. It's just sort of on all fronts, things have just gotten extraordinarily difficult.
I wonder if you, I have a question for you, sure. Since you're here. I wonder if you could talk a little more about what it's like to represent people in the detained context, because that's all the work you do, right, is representing people who are detained, and there are huge disadvantages, right, in the immigration system for...
Yes, so it moves very quickly, and it's, of course, not that I want my clients to be detained, but it doesn't do me any good to have a very fast hearing that I'm going to lose because we don't have any evidence. Unlike in, for example, the criminal justice system where the government bears the burden of the case, everything is on the non-citizen in immigration court. So we have to prove everything. And it's and like I said, with this narrowing of the laws and increasing of the burdens, it's extremely hard. You're trying to get evidence from faraway countries, from family members in rural villages who only speak indigenous languages, and you're getting pushed for the judge is pushing you to go faster and faster and faster, and yes, representing people in detention is obviously extremely emotionally draining work. I spend a lot of time in four county jails in New Jersey. Well, 3 in New Jersey and 1 in New York near Bear Mountain, or in Orange County. Yeah. So those are the 4 facilities where people who are in detained immigration proceedings in New York City are held. And I mean, there's no difference between the way people are treated there as opposed to if you're have been sentenced to a period of incarceration. And I mean, as you can imagine, sometimes the people who end up in detention are people with extreme mental health problems, people who have undergone severe trauma. And at some of the facilities, like, they get strip searched every time I go visit them. And I can only visit with them in person, face to face. Like, 2 days a week, and if I don't get there by 8 in the morning, it's not gonna, you know, the access is extraordinarily difficult, and people are just, people are subject to all of the same things that we see in our prison system, you know, solitary confinement, like horrific medical conditions, and just, yeah, everything. So it's just very obviously challenging for the people who are subjected to this treatment.
Well, I'll just add to that just a little bit in terms of the conditions of detention. As this system has been expanding so quickly, and as Emily mentioned before, there has been tremendous reliance on private companies and all forms of contracting, right? So the involvement of private companies is very important, but also a lot of local governments have gotten into the industry of detention. And so more and more companies and governments and people become dependent on this industry, on detention, and have very little motivation to see it decrease, right? And more people think of it as an expansion industry. And when profit is the goal, you make more money the fewer services and care that you provide for the immigrants detained. And while there are standards that are guidelines called the performance-based national detention standards, these are rarely enforced. Facilities are very rarely punished for not respecting the standards. And the current administration is actively working to erode those standards. So you see more and more instances of poorer and poorer care, such as medical care, horrible food, there's more and more abuses of, just general abuses of detained migrants, more required labor of migrants while they are detained. So there's just an escalation, or I guess a more and more deterioration of the conditions in detention.
Can I just say one thing to wrap this up? I think it's very important to remember that this is a civil system. This is not supposed to be a punitive system. The immigration system is a civil system. It's not a criminal system, and the people are not serving any kind of sentence. The only purpose of this system is supposed to be to ensure that people attend their hearings in immigration court and that they are available to be removed if they do not succeed in the immigration court, if they don't in some fashion win the status in the United States. So I think it's fair to say under the Obama administration, the idea that the system could be used as a form of deterrence became a very powerful idea, that if you sent a threat overseas, that you're going to be detained if you get here, that would deter immigration. That has, I think, proven conclusively to be a failed concept. But to a dramatic degree, what's happening now, I think, is the Trump administration is using the detention system to deter people from pursuing their claims and to persuade people that life is just so awful in detention that it's not worth it, even if you're coming from Central America, even if your daughter has been threatened with rape by a gang, even if you've been threatened with lethal violence, it's just not worth it to wait this out. And so a lot of what the policy is doing now is turning the detention system that is supposed to ensure your participation in the court system into a system that attempts to dissuade and discourage and eliminate your participation in seeking a legitimate claim. Is that?
Well, I think there's a lot more that we could say, but we do want to leave some time now for questions. We have about 15 or 20 minutes, so if people have questions.
I can bring you a mic.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for this. Is there any legislation? Are there any leaders on the horizon? Are organizations? Who is facing this head on and doing something, and what can people do? Other than send money and make phone calls, which I already
I think that there is a lot of local activism going on. I mean, there are many national organizations, I mean, fighting, working on behalf of detainees and family members. But just in our local area, there are organizations that support detained immigrants and their families. If you are detained in the New York City area, there are no long-term facilities here. So you're immediately shipped to the places where Amelia said that she works. And there's a lot of activism going on around those facilities in New Jersey. And I think a lot of what can be done is really bringing awareness to what is actually going on and really working to kind of tear apart those narratives of why people are being detained and what detention does, and expose all of the money making that is going on behind this. That's really driving this. That's really working to writing those laws. I mean, the lobbying and the money and the rejoicing that happened when President Trump was elected by people directly connected to immigration detention is, I think, a sign of how profitable it is. So I think bringing awareness to that is really important.
Vote. Mobilize people you know to vote. Many have said, and I think it's true, that I don't think that there's going to be a lot of reform if this administration continues into another term. So, unfortunately, the bigger questions of overhauling this system will not be answered until there's a new administration. So, vote.
And I would also say there are concrete things that people can do. There are some local organizations that provide, volunteers go visit people in the detention facilities. There's a lot of logistical help that is needed, especially for recently arrived asylum seekers who are released from detention. How do we get them to their family in Illinois or whatever? How do we get them from the jail to the, who is going to post their bond? Where do we get that bond money from? So the person, the bond amounts that get set in immigration court, we're lucky, quote unquote, here in New York City. But $10,000 is a regular amount to see for someone to have to pay to be released, and there's no paying a portion of that. It's all or nothing, and if you can't pay it, well, you're staying detained and you're doing your case detained. So there are definitely ways to be concretely involved in all of those ways. What would be some names that sorry, I don't know.
Volunteer for the New Sanctuary Coalition.
Yeah.
And the activities of the volunteers range from what I do, which is accompanying people to court when they have various kinds of hearings. So there is a bond fund that people can contribute to. There are many, many functions that people who are fluent in Spanish or Creole or other languages represented by the immigrants who are in trouble or in detention or need to appear in court. They have a clinic that these undocumented people can come to and consult and get lists of attorneys. And I'm sure all of you know about these, but anyway, one place is the New Sanctuary Coalition.
Yes, and there's also a bond fund. There's First Friends of New Jersey is the organization that coordinates a lot of detention visits and support for people who are currently detained. Families for Freedom. There are many.
In terms of dealing with the problem,
other than, I guess, a Marshall Plan for Central America to deal with what keeps coming, what public policy ideas have you heard or are there for dealing with, I don't know what the number is, but something 11 million now or 12 million people that are stuck? Has anybody come up with any practical ideas of how to deal with this?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, yes, I think we've talked about ideas of a Marshall Plan. Unfortunately, a lot of the plans that we have put in place through things like USAID and various government programs have actually proven to not be that effective. A lot of what the United States government has done up to this point has actually focused on security. So we have programs through the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and all these things that we say are meant to address the conditions in Latin America. And what they actually often do is go toward training police, go toward security mechanisms, go toward border and immigration policing. So I think if we really want to get effective policies, we need to actually focus on things that go toward improving people's lives and not just the policing of those lives. And so I think, and that's one thing through Democratic and Republican administrations is constantly occurs, right? We say we're going to improve the lives. I mean, I remember in the Obama administration, Vice President Biden proposed this whole program for Central America, and the bulk of that proposed money, a lot of it was canceled after the Trump administration took office, but actually was for things like policing. So we need to do more to think about what will actually improve people's lives in our policy making.
Yeah, and I would say so the recent trend has been, well, first of all, some significant part of the problem that exists, particularly in El Salvador, is directly related to United States law enforcement and immigration policy, because in the late 1980s and the 1990s, successive administrations began deporting from California to solve a gang problem that existed in East Los Angeles. They started deporting people back to El Salvador. And I was just in El Salvador this past year, and when I was there in May, the administration had finally set up a system with the Salvadoran police so that the Salvadoran police would actually know the criminal record of the person that was being deported. So for years, people who were really bad guys, I mean, we're talking about the Mara Salvatrucha, these are real bad guys. They were being deported in large numbers to El Salvador with not even basic information about what the Salvadorans could expect. And most recently, the Trump administration has canceled, as you mentioned, what aid there was for sort of good governance and at least civilian programs of one sort or another. Those were canceled, and in place, the administration has signed a series of, I think it's fair to describe them as being highly coercive. I mean, these were negotiations under threat of tariff with Honduras, with Guatemala, with El Salvador, by which Guatemala, for example, which I think is the third most dangerous country in the hemisphere if you're measuring the homicide rate, has signed an agreement that they will take people from Honduras who want to seek asylum in the United States. Guatemala has agreed now that those people must apply in Guatemala for asylum. Now, Guatemala, to my knowledge, doesn't even really have a functioning asylum system. But now you're taking people from the country that is either, is in a kind of ongoing competition to be either the first or the second most dangerous country in the world, which is in the hemisphere, which is Honduras. And you're forcing them to seek asylum in the third most dangerous country. So, and this is all under the rubric of this, migrant protection protocols. All of these agreements are, the headline is, this is migrant protection, so that you have a level of sort of bastardization, even of the basic language to describe these agreements that is just really egregious. And so, for the time being, the prospect of some sort of common sense, okay, let's identify who are the bad guys, let's have an agreement. If we're going to deport them, let's figure out a way that we can keep them detained and incarcerated in El Salvador, and let's figure out who are not the bad guys, and let's have a reasonable process so that they can come to the United States, and if they have a legitimate claim, that claim can be heard. That's not happening anytime soon, I don't think. Yeah, unfortunately.
And just a final point there. I mean, even when the United States is giving economic aid to a lot of these countries, it's often in the form of, let us come and invest in your country, in ways that destabilize and run out of business local businesses in those places, which just leads to worsening economic conditions, which pushes more people to migrate. So it really requires an entire rethinking of our economic policies, not just our migration and border policies.
I'm just curious, what's the current status of the children who are not reunited with potential family in the United States or their parents after they've gone through the deportation process and been granted asylum or some other permanent status?
So I can just speak to some of the cases that I'm looking at, have been looking at in the foster care systems. Some kids are under HHS and the Office of Refugee Resettlement. HHS is Health and Human Services. Unaccompanied minors have been going under their family detention is not really for unaccompanied minors, which is under ICE. So that's with a parent. So the kids who are separated, a lot of them are under HHS. Some of them are going into the foster care system. I've been talking to several lawyers and children and parents, foster parents who have taken in kids who no longer have anyone to step up, because people are so scared of being deported as well, that no one's really coming forward to say, I'll take this kid. And so many of them are going into foster care programs.
And then the other thing that happens I don't work a lot on the separated family issue, just because of the population that gets detained in New York City. But as far as unaccompanied minors, right, so there's less work being done to reunite them with somebody who will, present themselves as responsible for their care, so that they're released from ORR, the Office of, Refugee Resettlement, and just the extreme fear that people have. All of that has made it more difficult. And then when that child literally on their 18th birthday, they get woken up in the morning and brought to adult detention. And so then they become my client.
To complete your tapestry, could you tell us about Daca?
The question is, hi Peter, how are you? The question is, what's going on with Daca? Yeah, so we are, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This is the program that was created by Obama that gives a work permit and a protection from deportation to young people who came to the United States when they were children, sometimes called dreamers. And so the Trump administration canceled the program, but the cancellation of the program has been held up by the federal courts and is now, there has been oral argument at the Supreme Court, and as of this time, at any moment, but most likely, I would say in the end of the term, in June, we will get a decision from the Supreme Court. Now, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but most of the legal experts that I talk to think that DACA is going to lose, that this is a loser, because the president has vast authority to interpret the immigration laws, and this was never approved by Congress. There's not even an executive order on this one. This is just a policy that came from the Secretary of Homeland Security that said that, you know, if people are in this have these particular characteristics, you should consider the possibility on a case-by-case basis of giving them this protection. They do not, DACA people do not have any form of affirmative legal status in the United States. All they have is a protection from deportation. In effect, their deportation has been deferred. And so, and the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, made clear just in recent weeks that if DACA loses at the Supreme Court, that they will, the Department of Homeland Security will have no hesitation to proceed to initiate deportations of these young people. This is, of course, these are people that came here when they were kids. They have no notion, most of these folks have no notion of what the country is like where they were born. There are now probably 250,000 U.S. citizen children in the United States who have one parent who's a DACA person. So you're talking about deporting very large numbers of parents of United States citizen children. So this is a very bleak picture. The only thing that it does is possibly put into play some kind of legislative response from Congress right on the eve of the election. In other words, over the summer, right before the election, it might be that, you know, if that this administration would kind of use the deportations to try and leverage something out of Congress so that the president could say right before the election that he had been the champion of the DACA people and that, you know, that he had been the one to bring across the finish line the DREAM Act.
Well, time for one more final question.
How likely do you think it is that we will see a successful abolition of ICE?
Abolition?
None.
Zero.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this ICE is a huge agency that runs a number of, you know, it's just not going to happen. Also, like, administratively, like, that would also require all of the responsibilities that ICE does that are actually some of them needed, not, you know, in terms of detaining mass amounts of people, but there's some of that is needed and would have to be put into another agency. That's like a huge, that would be even under, you know, a Bernie Sanders or a Democrat, you know, I don't see that happening.
And I mean, I think it's important to remember that there are, you know, some number of super bad guys who are immigrants. And, you know, it's not, I believe, a bad idea to have a police force that's responsible for removing from the United States people who are well-established members of the Mara Salvatrucha. This is a legitimately very nasty organization. So to suggest that, you know, I think it sends the wrong message that when you're saying that you're unwilling to sort of distinguish between the vast majority of this of our immigrant population, who are people who have brought so many virtues to this country, but and you know, not recognizing that they don't want to be preyed on by these gang members either. You know, I mean, there is a place for a reasonable police force. It's just that the police force we have now is completely out of control.
Yeah, and just even taking that example, the government will often try to argue things like a school safety officer saw an immigrant child doodling the Salvadoran flag in their notebook at school, and that is the basis of labeling that young person as a gang member. So, yeah.
Right. So to wrap it up, and again, I'm with Julie on this, like the answer here looking forward under an administration that was willing to work on this is some sort of immigration reform that both creates pathways to citizenship and offers some security at the border that satisfies like the basic needs of, you know, safety for the country and for the American people, and I think that's reasonable. And what we hope you take away from this is that this system was not created by Donald Trump. This is a product of many administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, that has kind of emerged in the shadows and not really been prominent in the eyes of the American public. But Donald Trump and his administration have exacerbated these issues to such an extent that we can all see so clearly what is now happening and how bloated and overwrought this system now is, and the very real human consequences of it. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you very much to the Tenement Museum and to the Marshall Project.